Thanks for tuning in to this webinar. My name is Andrew Russell and I am a medical anthropologist with an interest in public health, specifically tobacco and tobacco control. I would like to share with you the outline of a book I am currently preparing on the anthropology of tobacco to be published by Routledge next year. I take my inspiration from the French philosopher and social scientist Bruno Latour and the field of material cultural studies more generally. Latour is critical of many social scientists for their failure to take the non-human elements seriously in their analyses. People have the upper hand. Things are simply the backdrop to what happens in human life. Latour treats non-human things on an equal footing with people. They have power, which others call agency, that we ignore at our peril. Tobacco is a good example of a non-human agent with great power in the world. Put bluntly, it gets people to do things, produce, distribute and use it, attempt to control it, and to research all of the above. Not bad going for a supposedly humble plant. In this presentation, I shall be looking at the ways in which tobacco has become an integral part of human life worldwide. I am taking a largely historical approach, using data from the arts and literature as well as social sciences. We can learn from the past in order to better understand and act in the present. Likewise, we can learn from experiences in other parts of the world in order to act more effectively in our own. Tobacco of the species now cultivated commercially originated in South America many millennia before humans arrived on the scene. The Americas were the last continents to be populated by humans, with a history of their peopling extending back tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands of years. Tobacco is estimated to have evolved millions of years before the arrival of humans from the north that is shown in this map. This is the first indication of the agency of tobacco. Rather than the higher nicotine concentrations of the species Nicotiana rustica and Nicotiana tabacum having been selected for through human horticulture, these qualities evolved many millennia before the arrival of people and any form of cultivation. The long time scale of people's interaction with tobacco, particularly in lowland South America, is the topic of an edited volume I prepared with a colleague, Elizabeth Rahman, called The Master Plant. The chapters in this book outline the extraordinary diversity of uses to which tobacco is put in lowland South America, or should we say, the ways in which tobacco has agency in human life there. As well as its use for various medicinal and recreational purposes in lowland South America, tobacco is used in hallucinogenic proportions in shamanic rituals as both a gift for the spirit world, since spirits, like their human counterparts, are said to love it, and as a spirit guide in its own right. Neophyte shamans, who are usually male, are encouraged to consume tobacco in copious amounts, sufficient to generate near-death and, in some unfortunate cases, literal death experiences. In his classic book documenting tobacco and shamanism in South America, the anthropologist Johannes Wilbert is struck by the extraordinary power of this agent of diffusion, evident in the rather strikingly similar tobacco ideology of American Indians that coincides with the limits of tobacco distribution in the New World. I haven't got time to go into the nature of this tobacco ideology, but I think it is summed up in the statement by a contemporary curandero or healer in Peru that tobacco is a plant with the energy to clean and cure. The YouTube clip embedded in this slide shows a Peruvian healer using tobacco smoke in a curative way to treat a girl who has had some kind of shock. All this is very different to the villainous reputation of tobacco in public health terms in many other parts of the world today. Of course, it's important not to overgeneralize about a region as vast and diverse as lowland South America. A number of Brazilian groups, such as the gay, are known as drug averse with no tradition of tobacco or any other form of ritual drug consumption. Nor is the use of tobacco in hallucinatory quantities and the near-death experiences it engenders for everyone. The dark shamans of the Warao tradition, for example, learn two kinds of hoa chants to both inflict and cure illness. The long-term and copious use of tobacco is recognized to change the appearance of a hoa chant master, who is described by Wilbert as engulfed in a nicotine-affected atmosphere of pungent percutaneous odor and chronic fetid breath, a not altogether enticing prospect. It's easy to forget that tobacco's escape from the confines of its American worlds only took place some 500 or so years ago, along with the tomato, maize, potato, and other New World plants. Columbus was not particularly interested in botanical products. He was in search of gold and gemstones and paid little heed to the highly valued dried leaves his crew members found the Taino people of Cuba smoking in 1492. During the 16th century, however, tobacco spread far and fast from Europe to Africa, India, and Asia, highlighting how interconnected societies of the Old World were, despite the precarious nature of travel in those days. It quickly became deeply embroiled in colonial history. In fact, tobacco is in many ways the mainstay of the development of colonial and subsequently capitalist economies. The exotic plant that seduced civilization, as Ian Gately puts it on the cover of his popular book about the cultural history of this master plant. It is tempting to ask who or what was colonizing whom. An indigenous American weed whose own conquest of the Old World began with the European conquest of the New is how one writer describes tobacco. This picture by de Bry shows Europeans at the periphery of a group of dancing Tupinamba Indians who are clearly performing a tobacco-based group ritual. All over Europe, people were coming to terms with the extraordinary plant that had arrived in their midst. In one early 17th century play by Thomas Tomkis, tobacco becomes a character talking on the stage, except no one can understand what tobacco is saying. Fortunately, olfactus, smell, the sense of that tobacco is supposed to be championing in the play, is there to give a translation. The great and puissant, powerful god of tobacco. He is the king of Trinidad, that in being conquered all Europe, in making them pay tribute for their smoke. As well as its fiscal significance hinted at here, there is a strong awareness of what might come to be known as the addictive qualities of the plant in the mention that tobacco is of so great deserts that whoso is acquainted with him can hardly forsake him. People find it hard to give up tobacco, a fact that was recognized as much then as it is now. For this and many other reasons, there was antagonism as well as welcome for tobacco, starting a tradition that has persisted to this day. King James I of England was dead set against it, as his counterblast to tobacco records. A custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black and striking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. King James is largely pilloried for the nature of his antagonism to tobacco, but some of his arguments make sense then as they do now in the field of what has been called lay epidemiology. If a sick man takes tobacco at the height of his disease, and afterwards the disease follows its natural course and declines, he will attribute his recovered health to the miracle of tobacco. By the same token, if someone smokes themselves to death with tobacco, then some other disease will be blamed for this misfortune, says James I. A study carried out in South Wales, United Kingdom, in the late 1980s, identified two types of person who gave the lie to commonly held beliefs and health messaging about lifestyle factors and their role in health outcomes. One was the fat Uncle Norman figure who has survived into a healthy old age despite extremely heavy smoking and drinking. Such a figure appears in the discourse of all age, gender, and class groups researched. The same is true, if less frequently observed, of the individual with the opposite experience, the slim, clean-living, last person you'd expect to have a coronary, who is then unfortunate enough to succumb. Let us call this person Fit Fred. We all, quite likely, have at least one of these two types of person in our own personal kin and friendship networks. Both the misattributions reported by King James and the power of the Uncle Norman or Fit Fred examples in people's lives are what the monarch called the mistaken practice of general experience. They all have serious implications for people's willingness to follow health regimens, such as healthy food, not drinking, not using tobacco, or conversely, to follow unhealthy relationships such as those involving the frequent consumption of unhealthy foods, drinking excessively, and either smoking, chewing, or otherwise engaging with tobacco in some form or other during everyday life. That is before you even think of exercise, the fourth component in the standard lifestyle-based initiatives in public health worldwide. Yet despite his antagonism, within 6 months of the publication of his counterblast in leaflet form, King James issued his Comissio por Tobacco, increasing the duty on tobacco by 4,000% in order to increase the wealth and prosperity of our Commonwealth. Tobacco dependency comes in many forms: of people on their product, of governments on its revenues, even, we might say, of tobacco control that tobacco should continue into the longer-term future. But tobacco is even more strongly linked to the colonial past than these kinds of dependency. It is fair to say that the first colonies of Virginia would have failed completely without the development of tobacco cultivation. The situation in India was similar to that of the UK. Shah Jahangir issued a decree against smoking in 1617, but such was the profit to his treasury through taxing tobacco that by the 1620s commercial tobacco production was taking place within India's borders. However, the colonial situation also makes the Indian experience with tobacco rather different. The East India Company had been curing tobacco in its Indian factories since 1612 and was only waiting for the opportunity to use India as a hub for export throughout Asia. The East India Company is described by Robbins as world-changing and the key shaper of the modern multinational. Tobacco, therefore, was at the forefront of the colonial and subsequently capitalist economies of the world. Yet there were also messages of resistance arising, such as, back in the UK, the bawdy pamphlet put out about some supposed hearings at a so-called gossip's hall. "I have been married to my husband about 14 years. This man hath been all his time a great smoker, and to tell you the truth, I was never got with child by him but once, and that was so feebly done that I may boldly say it was not half gotten, though he is a man as likely as any of his neighbours. And as for my own part, I am sure I am not in the least effective, but am as apt and fit for the work of generation as any of my neighbours. Nay, I may say as likely to be got with child as any woman in England. Let the other be what she will, yet this man cannot do the feat, and the reason why it is not done, I must clearly impute to his smoking that infernal Indian weed which they call tobacco." Such an approach to tobacco control can be seen in contemporary visual and verbal messaging, here from Egypt. It might be interesting to consider the potential to develop some kind of street theatre or other in India based on the values and concerns expressed by women at the gossip's hall. From dependency to enslavement, again at both political and individual levels. At the political level, in order to generate sufficient profit for the planters, the slavery system was initiated on the back of plantation agriculture, which included tobacco. I took the picture on the top right of this slide at the Liverpool Slavery Museum in January 2016. I was struck by the placement of the pipes and the shackles of slavery next to each other and tried to capture that. Western seaboard cities in the UK, Bristol, Liverpool, and to a certain extent Glasgow, were all tobacco trade cities. They were also the source of textiles, rum, and manufactured goods that were taken to West Africa and of the money to finance the entire slavery triangle. So in that sense, they are also cities built on the wealth of slavery as much as tobacco. The slaves were transported on the second leg or middle passage. One of the most poignant stories in Fox's The Archaeology of Tobacco is of how African captives, many of them destined for American tobacco plantations, were sometimes given tobacco and pipes to placate them during that voyage. Meanwhile, in literature and cartoons, clubs of gentlemen, such as Sam Scott's Smoking Club, are described, their participants imbibing tobacco in enormous quantities over extended periods of time. This was tobacco consumed in intoxicating, not to say hallucinatory amounts, just like the tobacco shamans in lowland South America. In the colonies, tobacco was used as a drug food to capture and enhance labour for performance, as it was euphemistically put. It was enslavement of a different sort anyway. But it was the development of the Bonsac cigarette-making machine in 1883 which transformed the tobacco industry entirely and paved the way for the corporate forms of tobacco we see today. This machine permitted manufacture of 8,000 cigarettes per hour. The Bonsac cigarette machine was as productive as 80 women. They were usually women because they were seen as having the nimble fingers necessary for cigarette making by hand. In order to compensate for the explosion in production, companies such as H.D. Wills started selling cigarettes at vastly reduced prices, such as 10 for a penny. The First World War was also an important means for tobacco to promote itself, and tobacco consumption in the UK reached its peak in terms of number of people smoking after the Second World War, in 1948 for men and 1970 for women. Let us now think about the contemporary situation. Doesn't this map of the dominant corporations in the 4th edition of the Tobacco Atlas remind you of the maps of the colonial states of the late 19th and early 20th centuries? As well as the 4 major transnational corporations, state-owned corporations are the dominant form in the People's Republic of China and 81 other countries in the world. People have worked hard identifying the negative effects of so-called harm industries such as tobacco. In The Bottom Line or Public Health, VIST highlights numerous ways in which corporations can negatively influence people's health. One is agnotology, the deliberate manufacture of ignorance and doubt. This can be through challenging science and intimidating researchers, but its public health effects owe more to the overt and covert forms of marketing which take place, the myths that have developed around illegal, smuggled tobacco, as well as industry funding of front groups, such as those shown here. The tobacco industry, partly because of the legal restrictions on advertising budgets in many parts of the world, is looking for ways of making further use of its money in promoting its products. Corporate social responsibility activities are frequently of great benefit to its recipients, yet they also serve to increase public confusion over the moral worth of the tobacco industry. I would like to stress that we know a lot more about tobacco than we do about most similarly secretive corporations because of the Masters' Settlement, which led to the formation of a legacy library containing millions of subpoenaed documents that demonstrate all of these traits. The bottom line indicates merely breaking even, but according to Bakan, it is the profit motive that is one of 2 key elements in corporations' pathological pursuit of profit and power. The famous picture of industry representatives testifying on oath at Senate hearings that tobacco is not known to be addictive is instructive. There was similar agnotology going on about the disease risks associated with long-term tobacco use. The tobacco industry valued the profit motive over people's health. Global public health can sometimes be criticized for not taking tobacco production issues as seriously as tobacco consumption ones. After all, tobacco is not grown everywhere. The extensive messaging on auto rickshaws around the Indian Expo Centre and Mart, where the 7th Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was being held last November, was a clever ploy. Protect my livelihood. I am a tobacco farmer. People in tobacco control talk about astroturfing, apparently grassroots organisations funded and hence fronting hidden corporate interests. The Federation of All India Farmer Associations is one such organisation, extensively funded by tobacco industry interests. We appeal to the government to probe and expose the hidden agenda of agencies engaged in anti-tobacco campaigns. The implication is that NGOs working in tobacco control who are in receipt of foreign funds are working to some hidden agenda, seeking to develop an environment in which transnational tobacco corporations can gain a foothold. Nothing could be further from the truth. Article 17 of the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control now commits activists and governments alike to pursue alternative livelihoods for tobacco farmers with a view to eliminating tobacco, not permitting it in by another route. The industry can counter with the importance of tobacco to the Indian economy and employment. I don't need to say to this audience that such an argument is not simply of intellectual or academic interest. It has consequences for institutions doing important work, such as the Institute for Public Health, which have been at the receiving end of this counter-campaign. Is there some way we can challenge the industry narrative? An anthropological study of tobacco farming in the USA shows numerous ways in which the agnotological myths that exist surrounding tobacco and its place in the economy are fostered through campaigns such as that of the tobacco company R.J. Reynolds in the 1970s called Pride in Tobacco. Matthew Corman has recently published evidence of similar efforts to establish the moral worth of people working in and for the tobacco industry that are made by the Shanghai Tobacco Museum in China. One way of doing this in the US has been to try and establish a romantic image of tobacco grown on a predominantly white family farmstead rather than as part of a global industry. Benson records many conflicted farmers' narratives in his study. He also collects the stories of the migrant labourers so easily ignored otherwise. Benson exposes some of the myths, showing us that the life of tobacco growers in the neoliberal monetary economy is not always a rosy one. The growers in Benson's study, like their counterparts in India, I am sure, are often extremely anxious at the vulnerability to their loss or drastic reduction in the money they are given for their crop. US farmers are all on annual contracts. However, the situation is far worse for those down the labour chain, such as the migrant labourers from Mexico and elsewhere. Shocking stories of child labour being used in the tobacco fields of Malawi can be matched, I am sure, by the experience of many women and children involved in various aspects of tobacco cultivation and processing in India. I am proposing we need a new way of thinking about tobacco. I like that indigenous American weed whose own conquest of the old world began with the European conquest of the new description. Tobacco has conquered the world, but it has not been able to do it alone, only in a hybrid relationship with tobacco persons and tobacco corporations. Tobacco's conquest can be seen at the level of person as parasitic. Tobacco is given a voice again in Richard Craze's book, The Voice of Tobacco. Just another parasite with a bizarre breeding cycle, he calls it. I am just the host for it. The more I smoke, the more it gets planted. A successful crop, trading its strange pleasure for increased growth. Craze is unusual in portraying tobacco corporation workers as being as much its victims as us, the poor smokers at the end of the chain. Craze's book was subtitled A Dedicated Smoker's Diary of Not Smoking. We are not told in the book whether he was able to maintain his dedication. Tobacco's voice, when Craze reflects on his progress at the end of the book, is menacing. You will smoke again. There is no doubt about that. I am your dark lord, and you will obey. It is only a question of time. I will catch you off guard one lonely, cold winter's evening, and you will come back to me. You will return to the fold, and I will be triumphant. The question of time became irrelevant 3 years after the book's publication, however. Craze died of a heart attack, aged 56. The outcome from all I have presented, tobacco's colonial past and its parasitic, colonizing present, is one of the most, if not the most, important public health problems the world has ever known. 1 in 2 lifelong smokers is killed by tobacco, and most smokers lose many years of active life. The world's greatest cause of preventable death, the only consumer product which, when used as directed, kills its consumer. Tobacco is a commodity with the prospect of causing 1 billion deaths in the 21st century, 70 to 80% of them in low and middle income countries. What is strange is that such a situation has, until recently, been regarded as almost normal. But as the legislative infrastructure and governance frameworks in so-called developed countries become stronger, denormalizing tobacco use in the process, so the transnational industry increases its efforts to develop and manipulate markets in the low and middle income countries. However, the NGOs are not to blame for this infiltration, contrary to what the tobacco farmer example claimed. It is the tobacco industry and its need for profits, despite the consequential harm for human health, that are at the root of the problem. So tobacco has created a global problem that needs a global solution. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is one solution to this problem. I have mentioned some of its articles, such as that for alternative livelihoods in this presentation. There are many others, such as Article 5.3, that need to be supported and respected. Article 5.3 aims to stop tobacco industry interference in life outside of the industry. To conclude, I have used my anthropological background to present tobacco as an active agent, a substance that has managed an impressive parasitic conquest of the world. The dependency on which this conquest is based takes many forms: of consumers on an addictive product, of governments on its tax revenues, of workers on the employment and income it provides, and of corporations on its profits. Yet we have seen that, whether it is amongst the communities of lowland Amazonia, Europe, or India, tobacco has always been contentious and controversial. Studying the cultural history of tobacco and tobacco control can offer inspiration for public health initiatives in the present. 500 years ago, the old world was a world without tobacco. Dare we imagine the future return of such a world? I haven't had time to answer this final question in this presentation, but I hope I have raised plenty of questions about how we imagine tobacco in the world today and how we think about the future because of it. Thank you.